New Grub Street is a novel by George Gissing published in 1891, which is set in the literary and journalistic circles of 1880s London. The story deals with the literary world that Gissing himself had experienced. Its title refers to the London street, Grub Street, which in the 18th century became synonymous with hack literature. By Gissing's time, however, Grub Street itself no longer existed, though hack writing certainly did. Its two central characters are a sharply contrasted pair of writers, Edwin Reardon, a novelist of some talent with limited commercial prospects, and Jasper Milvain, a young journalist, hardworking and capable of generosity but cynical and only semi-scrupulous about writing and its purpose in the modern world. Thank you for tuning into The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. With me today to discuss this wonderful novel are Doctors Katy Mullin, Ue and Richard Menke. Dr. Mullin is professor of modern literature and culture at University of Leeds. Her research explores connections between late-Victorian and modernist fiction and sexuality and popular culture. She's the author of James Joyce's Sexuality and Social Purity and another book titled Working Girls, Fiction, Sexuality and Modernity. Dr. Wu is an assistant professor in English of the long 19th century at Cape Breton University and advising editor of the Complete Letters of Henry James at University of Nebraska Press. He is the author of Sherlock Holmes and Shakespeare. He also writes extensively on George Gissing and Harry Rycroft. Dr. Menke is an associate professor of English at the University of Georgia. He's the author of Telegraphic Realism, Victorian Fiction, and Other Information Systems, and another book titled Literature, Print Culture, and Media Technologies from 1880 to 1900, Many Inventions. Welcome to the show, everybody. Well, Katy, shall we start with how the protagonist Reardon's struggle between artistic integrity and commercial success reflects those broader social tensions around creativity and financial stability during the Victorian era?
Oh, thank you very much, Claire. Thank you for your lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this podcast on New Grub Street, which is one of my very favourite novels. So if we're thinking about how the novel kind of foregrounds and engages with contemporary issues around the balance between artistic integrity and commercial success, we kind of have to locate it in its time. Although it's published in 1891, as you mentioned in your introduction, it's set in the 1880s, around the early 1880s, when debates about the form and the politics and the kind of the limits of the Victorian novel were very much current and being hotly debated in the literary periodicals of the day. Much of those debates revolved around the novel's form. Because Victorian writers were constrained and had been constrained for about 40 or 50 years before the publication of New Grub Street to write in 3 volumes for the circulating libraries. So how the Victorian book market worked was a novel would be published in 3 volumes priced at 31 shillings and sixpence, which is way beyond the pockets of any. Even middle-class readers couldn't afford that kind of outlay on an individual novel. So they used to subscribe to circulating libraries. The most famous one is Moody's, who would lend out the books for the guinea subscription, the guinea annual subscription that was required. If a book was sufficiently popular under this system, it would later on be published in cheaper forms for mass sale. And also, if a book was or a novelist was particularly successful, they might be able to sell serial rights to the novel in one of the many fiction magazines that were around at the time. So Dickens, Trollope, George Eliot all serialised their novels. And Hardy did it. Hardy was always selling his novels several times over, once in serial version and then in the novel form, and then later on as a cheaper edition. But for writers like Gissing, who did not have that kind of popular appeal, they were increasingly kind of constrained by this mode of publication, particularly because it was customary to sell the copyright to anything they wrote. So you'd sell the copyright, off it would go. The publisher would publish it in this 3-volume form. If it wasn't a massive smash hit, that's the last you'd see of any money. So there's what happens around in the 1880s is that writers get increasingly agitated about the commercial inhibitions, the way that they can't really earn money from writing unless they're going to write bestsellers, and also the inhibitions around their creative practice, because there's a strong impetus to write fiction that would sell. and fiction that catered to the popular taste. So the big question coming out of the 1880s was what happens to writers of serious literary purpose, writers like Gissing himself, like George Moore, Henry James. What do these writers do, and how do they frame themselves in this climate? Tom, I don't know if you want to. Do you want to come in here? I don't want to kind of hog the whole.
Oh, sure. I could talk a bit about this issue of novelistic form, which Katie has talked about has introduced so well, and I think that speaks to one of Gissing's innovations here, because he's so very much aware of the form of the novel. And in a very, very early scene, he tells his sisters Maud and Dora that, why don't you, well, he asks them, well, why don't you write um these these Sunday school prize books? And they were like, well, why would we want to do this? And he's like, well, okay, you know you can learn how to do this, and you can just read like a half dozen of these specimens, study them, learn about how they work, and try to replicate this. Now, of course, for most of us, we're like, hey, so you don't actually care about what you're doing. You're just trying to replicate. But now Gissing does more here. And I think we do well to put some pressure on on his text, because even though Dora and Maud may be replicating the form of the Sunday prize book, it doesn't mean that they just have to import that form. They can also do things with it. And I think that Gissing's own novel does that with his three volume structure. He's very self conscious about the fact that the three volume novel is on its way out, but he does a three-volume novel here. He's so very self-conscious about the fact that people are using conversation to fill up the pages of a novel. But here we are. We have pages and pages of conversation about things that are not necessarily very relevant to the story. But he moves us along by means of that. And I think that's one of his many achievements here. But as Case points out, there's this irony that's in this novel where, he's telling us, okay, you know, this thing is on the free volume novel is on its way out, but here is a free volume novel that reads very well, that holds together too. But there's also this thing about the slipperiness of his position. Where does he stand in this? So he's pointing to the fact that this thing is on its way out, but at the same time he's still doing it. And that's kind of what happens with one of our main characters, Jasper Milvain, and I'll look forward to hearing Katie's thoughts about that, about this character whom we are supposed to despise, but then at the same time, we don't. At least I don't really. I know my friend Richard equates me to Milvain, so maybe that has something to do with it.
Right, right. Well, Richard, could you briefly talk about the historical background of the printing and writing as a developing industry that underlies the major plotline of the novel?
Yes, sure, of course. Thank you, Claire. Well, I think we sometimes think about print culture as just one thing, especially in the 21st century when we might worry that we're at the end of print culture, or it's being transformed radically. But it really undergoes a lot of changes from Gutenberg to the 20th century. And a lot of the biggest changes happen in the 19th century. So the 19th century brings really the application of new kinds of techniques to printing in particular. Of all the media revolutions of the century, we could think of the telephone and the electric telegraph and the phonograph and the typewriter and even radio and motion pictures at the end of the century. A lot of the revolutionary technologies are actually concern print. So we have the rotary press, the kind of presses you see in old Hollywood movies when they say, stop the presses. And we have the application of steam and later electricity to printing. So it really ramps up the speed of printing. It turns printing from a kind of artisanal industry into sort of a true kind of modern sort of like factory-like industry. And so New Grub Street is a story about writers, a story about intellectuals. But the whole framework for the novel at least in my opinion, concerns these wholesale changes to the business of writing that are becoming very clear by the end of the century when Gissing is writing.
That's great. Well, Tom, could you please share more on what Gissing's major experiments with the novelistic form are and how our reading is shaped by new developments in the novel?
For sure. I feel like now I'm going to launch into a defense of Milvain, and maybe Richard is right, and maybe there is something of him in me. But hopefully, the better bits, the energy, because I think we can all appreciate the energy in Milvain. It's a bit like Becky Sharp and Amelia, isn't it, from Vanity Fair, where we are driven by Becky's narrative, and with Amelia we just flip the pages and get the story moving, and that's kind of how it is with Milvain. Now, I follow the late critic Robert Selleck Robert Selleck argues that the thing here is that with Biffen and Reardon, we tend to associate these writers with literary value and artistic integrity, but neither of them is a particularly good writer. They only demonstrate promise in the case of Reardon, and in the case of Biffen, he's only doing his own thing. So neither of them is really all that great of a writer. I just want to point that out. Now, in terms of Milvain, he's very well aware of his limitations. He knows that he is not a novelist, and there are suggestions that he has tried writing a novel, and Gissing himself has tried writing plays. Now, he has tried, but he is not successful in that arena, so he's now turning to journalism, and that works for him. Now, one of the most often quoted lines in New Grub Street is from Milvain. If only I had the skill, I would produce novels out-trashing the trashiest that ever sold 50,000 copies. So if he could, he would do this, right? But the bit that isn't really quoted very much is the sentence before. Let us use our wits to earn money and make the best we can of our lives. Let us use our wits to earn money and make the best we can of our lives. I think that sums up a very different aspect of Milvain. He's trying to survive in the ways that he can in this climate that is not very hospitable, is extremely commercial. And, he has some talent in journalism, in this kind of writing. He's doing his best. He knows his limitations. He's doing his best. He's trying to survive. I think that we would do well to think about this aspect of this character, who is very frank about his agenda. He has very few pretensions. He doesn't have a whole lot of ambitions, even though he is ambitious. But, he's doing his best.
Right. Well, just as you mentioned, the character Mulvin represents a paradigm of literary success fueled by commercial tactics, contrasting with Reardon's artistic ideals. So, Tom, where do we find the narrator's voice stand between the artistic pursuit of literature and the commercial demands of the publishing industry? And how does the narrative balance both aspects, and what commentary or lesson does it offer about the intersection of art and commerce during that era?
This is such a great question. And in terms of this literary landscape, Gissing is responding in some ways to this really important novel by Walter Besant, who became the president of the Society of Author, and who is really everywhere in the literary scene in the 1880s, 1890s, and so forth. So Gissing is responding to this novel called All in a Garden Fair, which came about in 1883. And in that novel, Walter Besant talks about how there are 14,000 people who are living by literature in London alone at that time. 14,000 people. Now, if we are to look at the statistics that are given by the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, the ALCS, which a lot of us are registered with in a lot of writers are registered with. So if we look at the statistics from last year, the median of income of our author earnings has dropped to £7,000 in a year, like for a whole year. That's an annual income of £7,000. And in 2006, it was 12,330. So £7,000 is not enough to live on, but it also represented a 60% drop once you adjust inflation. Significant drops in author incomes. And we also would want to factor in the fact that even in this number, in the £7,000, this average income of writers, you're putting in some really heavy earners. Like if you're thinking about this average, it includes some very heavy earners. The top 10% of authors earn about 47% of all author incomes. So the picture is incredibly bleak, right? We're talking about a system and a profession that isn't very sustainable. So I think that in this climate, New Grub Street offers a very compelling picture of the commercial and the material concerns that writers face, as well as how that informs our day-to-day lives. I think that most of us are writing on the side as opposed to writing full time. Very, very few writers are working full time. So according to the statistics, again, this is last year, the proportion of authors earning all their income from writing has decreased from 40% in 2016 to 19%. And we're talking about the population registered with the ALCS, and that isn't everybody. So very few writers are only writing. Gissing is describing a group of people who are still trying to keep things going. And I think now in this climate, we are we're coming from a place where we just know that we can't just be writing professionally anymore. Or we can survive as just professional writers.
Richard, your essay titled New Grub Street's Ecology of Paper offers an intriguing perspective of reading the novel by accentuating the backdrop of the development of paper-making industry at the time. And what's so fascinating about it is that it draws our attention to the resource ecologies and even the natural histories of the late 19th century authorship, media, and print capitalism at large. Could you elaborate more on how the background of the material culture and especially the development of paper-making industry undergird the major plot lines of the novel?
Sure, Claire. Well, I think that when we think about ecology in literature, we might think about nature writing. And there's hardly any nature in New Grub Street. It's a predominantly urban novel about all these intellectuals and their struggles, living in a kind of very modern-seeming London. But I was interested in the ways in which the radical transformations in the paper industry, part of these transformations of print culture, are in the background of the novel, but really there. So as far as the history, basically European paper for hundreds of years is made from old underwear. It's made from cotton and linen rags. And so the rag and bone man is going around collecting rags to be made into a pulp for paper. But this is a very kind of laborious process, and you need a lot of rags to produce papers. And so as the industry of print explodes, as you have phenomena like a growing mass literacy, more leisure, even things like commutes during which people could read and were bored and wanted to read printed materials, you really kind of hit a kind of a choke point for the production of paper. And so there are all of these attempts to come up with other ways of manufacturing paper. But the sort of the two things that really kind of break through are during the Civil War. The British start making paper out of esparto grass from the Mediterranean, this just kind of grass that grows in Mediterranean hillsides, and to make this nice soft paper that's great for books. And then at the end of the century, they discover how to cut down trees and make trees into paper. So we think of books as dead trees, but this is really a kind of like modern conception that books used to be made of underwear. And so this kind of explosion at the end of the century in the production of printed materials is fueled by this living biomass that's harvested largely from northern forests in places like Scandinavia and Canada, and often imported to large markets like in the U.S. or in Britain. So and there's no real kind of attention to sustainable forestry or anything at this time. These forests are cut down to make the next day's news, and that paper, unlike a lot of rag paper, is not recycled. It's just discarded. So there's a kind of radical change in the resourcing of paper that underlies this explosion of print that New Grub Street is all about. So for me, one of the challenges and one of the exciting things about reading New Grub Street in this way is connecting it to a whole circulation of global resources, connecting this very urban novel to the real forests and the Mediterranean scrublands with their esparto grasses that were being rapidly harvested, and in some cases in the Mediterranean desertified, in order to provide the raw materials for this exciting, exploding modern print culture.